So I get to introduce Svea Sigmund again. And this time, I get to introduce Svea with Benjamin Young. So our next session today is HTML-first at Wiley, or how we learned to stop worrying and love the DOM. Benjamin Young is a web, digital publishing, and an open source advocate. Benjamin's focus is on content and how human beings interface with it and each other around it. He currently explores the edges of a decentralized web using annotation, distributed identity, and offline-friendly web apps and extensions. Benjamin is currently a solutions architect at John Wiley & Sons, where he works on the Web Annotation Working Group and Digital Publishing Interest Group at the W3C. Svea Sigmund is Wiley's Information Standards Lead. I think we all know her. She already was up here a little while ago. I'm going to truncate this part. Svea wrote and maintained Wiley's ebook specifications and style sheets and serves as Wiley's liaison to the industry standards group. So welcome, Svea and Benjamin.
I remember when I lost my mind. There was something so pleasant about that place.
So good. I had to represent for the South.
Hey, so my bio didn't change in the last hour.
No.
Okay.
It's still you.
So we're going to talk about how we are trying to be HTML first at Wiley. So let's get started. First, a shout out to Iris for drawing my avatar. Okay. So what does HTML stand for? You probably think you know. Here's what it's going to stand for in our presentation: history, technology, markup, and layers of information. Let's talk a little bit about Wiley, the history of Wiley. That's a cover from 1864. We've been around for more than 200 years. I'm going to jump over the first 190 years and go right to the 90s. In the 90s, we started going XML first, like a lot of other publishers, so that we could do things a little bit faster with a little bit more of a digital focus, and get our books and journals, mostly our journals, because a lot of our revenue comes from journals, and almost all of our digital workflows are focused on journals, so that we could get things to print and to digital faster. The Wiley ML proprietary format has been our primary interchange format for print and digital products since the 90s. Wiley ML, as I said, is a proprietary format. It's built internally. It is maintained constantly. It's updated constantly. We're now on version 3.2, I believe. And there's some talk of version 4. It's a relax NG schema with all sorts of validation, and it's huge. It is robust. It supports our books, our journals, and our learning management system. But now we're looking at what our readers need again, and it's time to look at the web. So we're looking at an HTML-based format, and as our manager put it, it's HTML somewhere for now. So we're looking at what we call Melville. We published Type E in 1846. That was the book cover we were looking at before. And it's a little nod to our origins. And of course, Melville sounds a little bit like ML, so it's a cute little pun. So content. Content is queen, but there are lots of formats. We still do lots of paper. Our books, for the most part, are published as paper books. Very few of our journals are published as book. Back in the 90s, when everybody started shifting to XML, very few, the paper journals were kind of phased out. If you talk to any of your friends in the STEM world, almost all of the journals are read online now. But we do still do a few print journals. A lot of them are print on demand, but they're still there. Wiley ML, as I said, is XML. It's digital, but it's still a very print-focused digital. Even though journals are not necessarily printed, the structure of the XML still assumes a print-based workflow. For example, for a book, everything is composed in a chapter-like structure. All of the metadata is inside the chapter. For a journal, all of the metadata is inside the journal article. And all of the processing information is inside the journal article. With Melville, we separated out into what we're calling content atoms. It contains some, but not all of the metadata, and most exciting, we have the Wiley information model, which is linked data, which we'll talk about a little bit more, and that associates the metadata, but does not contain it. And now we'll move on to the technology part. And there's a little shout out to Google Slides for not supporting transparent pings.
because they don't. Yeah, so let's take a look at the layers of content and hierarchical structures. The XML format that we have and most of the content management systems that exist treat content as if it's a tree, and that has proved to be insufficient, and it's not informed by the history of the web as well. This quote for our Melville white paper talks about how we needed a more flexible model, something that could not ignore the tree, but like coexist with it. And it turns out that this guy named Tim Berners-Lee back in like 1989 or so wrote this thing called Information Management, a proposal, which became the web. And on this slide is a very convoluted graph of lots of circles and arrows and their relationship between the circles and the cloud, not that we called it that back then, and a bunch of tree-based things that no longer exist, like IBM Group Talk, and Inquire, which was one of Tim's first inventions. So this like 9-page PDF, I don't know how many pages HTML, document explains what became the web, but its underpinning concept is a graph, and that this thing with an identifier, a web page, can link to, point at something else in the graph, typically another document, but could also point to a real human being or something like that. So we use these graph concepts to mix and sort of divide data and content, and I'm sure Dave could have come up with some great poem for this part. But we've got some examples on this slide, and there will be more later, about a journal title being both metadata and content at the same time. We use linked data in the form of RDFA, again, which I'll dive into more, and point at this as a name, and then the name is in the content. That's also informed by our data model and our content management systems. So we'll keep going through this section. Here's another example of what the graph sort of looks like as text. This is a turtle format, so you can see under graph there is the identifier, that's shortened for slides, and then schema name is the one used here, and then the really awesome article, which of course I probably wrote. No, Svea wrote, I edited, or vice versa. And then there it is again in RDFA. Again, very short HTML because slide. HTML about is saying I'm talking about this thing over here, identified as that, and it has this property, which is name, and this is its name. Really awesome article. So if in the graph database we update the name of really awesome article to really, really awesome article, then when we push it through the pipeline, that chunk of HTML gets updated as well. So the HTML contains both a pointer to the existence of the data as well as the data itself at time of printing. But then if we reprocess it, we can update those pieces. All of this is based on linked data. The slides should be online. I tweeted out about that about 2 minutes ago, if my robots are working. And the linked data link on that slide goes to a video that you can watch that explains how all this is super awesome. Here's another one. Not sure why I made so many of these. This one just shows it changing, which is cool. All right, now back to Svea.
So how did we get all of this started? Way back before Benjamin came to Wiley, there was a group of 5 of us that were told, you're going to make HTML-first happen at Wiley. You're the XML team plus Svea. So Svea was like, yes, HTML, and the XML people were like, what? And they kind of locked us in a conference room and said, write a paper telling us how to do this, or why we're doing it. So we came up with technical requirements, and for like 3 hours a day for 4 months, we wrote a white paper, which is not available for public consumption, but I can give you the highlights. So we started with technical requirements. And these are some of our technical requirements. Available for today's web, annotatable, archivable, modular, addressable, leverages open standards, supplementable with data, accessible, transformable, validatable, generate useful documentation automatically, annotatable, I think I have that there twice, editable, and avoid redundancy. This sounds super easy. It also sounds a lot like the work we're doing in the W3C. Coincidence? No. So let's talk about how we achieve some of those. Usable for today's web. Well, there's HTML for you. One of the reasons that we're switching from XML is that XML is a fantastic format for interchange, but it's not actually useful to a user. If I publish something in XML, it's not actually published to the user. It has to be transformed into something else to be customer facing. It's transformed to HTML, it's transformed to EPUB, it's transformed to PDF. A customer never touches XML. So HTML actually makes sense because we're already doing it. It just hasn't been standardized by the publisher in most cases. Annotatable, there are lots of things annotatable using with the web annotations data model. Karen showed some examples from Hypothesis. Benjamin here has a project called Apache Annotator where he's making things annotatable using that tool. Archivable is kind of a work in progress. I think that I'll start the call to action. We need to form some sort of standard for archiving, and publishing because we don't really have anything around that right now. So that could be my next project once we finish, web publications. And then, of course, doing all of these things requires open standards. One of the things that we've concentrated on in Melville is making it modular. We separate the content from the metadata to enable modularity. We've shifted away from coupling the content with the product. So what does that mean? A lot of us, we hear words like modularity a lot, and sometimes we used to call this chunking with XML, but chunking often meant duplicating information because you had to have extra information to make sure that chapter 1 and chapter 2 both had all of the information associated with it, so that I actually knew what chapter 1 was referring to. What this actually enables when you have linked data associated with it is limiting the duplication of information, which we recall was one of the other requirements. Because a lot of metadata actually is associated with the product that is the deliverable. So let's take the example of ISBNs. I think we're all familiar with ISBNs. ISBNs are actually associated with the deliverable. If I make the ISBN a part of the content, then when I have a new deliverable, I have to redo the content, and there my modularity kind of dies because I have to change everything. So if I disassociate the ISBN from the content and make it part of the linked data, then I don't have to change my content just because I have another deliverable. And a lot of us are familiar with this with things like Onyx feeds, but when we're doing this inside the internal workflow, if my metadata is totally disassociated from my content except for one link, then it's much cleaner. And of course, modularity enables delivery to multiple products. Accessibility. I feel like a broken record here. I feel like if I use that for another 5 years, no one will know what it means. So we have great HTML structure, ARIA, but only one applicable. MathML, we are a very large math and chemistry publisher. We have math everywhere, and image descriptions, budget of allowing. Over to you.
All right. Yeah, that record thing's not going to last much longer.
Vinyl is it?
Vinyl, that'll work. Hipsters know what that is. So yeah, let's look at addressable and annotatable. I've combined these because they're very interrelated. Addressability gets you not only the option to point at the thing as a whole, but also defining things within it. So fragment identifiers and saying, this part of the content has this ID. I've got creator 1234. I'm sure we have that somewhere. That can exist in the document, and then you're pointing at that creator inside of that document if you have the whole URL, which is fine. Those are sort of author or publisher provided identification locations, but what if you want to provide commentary about the last name of that creator? Then you need something more fine-grained, which is where the web annotation spec comes in. It gives you both the ability to talk about things that have identifiers, as well as selecting inside of those with what we call sub-resources. But terminology from the spec aside, it gives you the ability to talk about the smaller and smaller pieces of a video, an image, the text, or whatever resource you might have, in addition to author or publisher provided identifiers. We use both of those things to talk about things as they go through our pipeline. So we talk about them in relationship to the data model. This chunk of content or content atom exists from this CMS or the data from this graph, et cetera. But then we also use web annotation to talk about the things that need to change that are either part of that data or part of the content in the editorial process, and then maybe someday in post-editorial review or peer review. And all of that is based on the W3C recommendation called Web Annotation Data Model.
Which Benjamin wrote.
Which I had some part in. This slide includes a fabulous picture of a fabulous toy, Optimus Prime, who is missing an axe and has some sort of orange weapon thing. I don't know where those are from. I like his axe better. So I renamed this guy to Optimize Prime. Our goal is to make all of it transformable. Right now we have mostly Wiley ML. Obviously there are other needs like JATS-ML. Huh? There's a typo. You're not supposed to call that out during the presentation. She spelled EPUB wrong. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, we collaborated on these slides, so we share the blame. EPUB as well as Melville. So right now everything sort of starts its existence in the process as Wiley ML and can go out to these many things. But at some point we want to move to Melville because it's web first and it's already ready for that. So that part's done and we can ship straight there. But then we want to go from that format to other formats that are not webby. You can keep laughing about your typo? All right, trivia question for later. All right, this slide is about validation and includes another excellent image found by Svea of men shackled to walls in some ancient carving, although it's dated 1951 for reasons I don't understand. And I think she chose that image because one of the things we use to validate our RDFA is a thing called shackle, which lets you take the graph and say, this is what shape it needs to have when it's expressed as a tree. There's several others formats for doing this with JSON called JSON framing. And we need to be as aware of the fact that these sort of sentence structure graphy things that come down to subject, predicate, object statements, when they are put in a tree, still have the right shape and still show up in the same place. So we end up using lots and lots of different validation tools, including the fabulous EPUB check that you're all soon to be contributors to, ACE by Daisy, RelaxNG is one we use a whole lot as well. Making things editable from the Melville is a work in progress. There are several open source projects and some new startups, Nellie McKeeson's Hedris among them, that work to take non-markup language formats like Word and push them through transformation, Optimize Prime tools. Just going to use that from now on. And turn them into markup languages. Our hope is to continue to champion things like scholarly HTML, which is sort of a foundation that we build up from for Melville, that would allow this to exist in open source editorial tools like, or editing tools like ProseMirror and others. We hope to be contributing actual code to some of these as well. And I mentioned a few on that last slide. So avoiding redundancy, Wiley ML, in our case, includes everything you need to do everything. Once it exists, it has processing, it has style, it has content, it has metadata, and it's all right there in that one file, which is fine for what it is. Melville provides layers of intermixing, but that they can also be separated from one another so that the redundancy is hopefully avoided as much as possible. This also is still a work in progress for us. And now Svea gets this slide. Yay.
You can take a moment to coo. So let's talk a little bit about the markup. So we need this to be fully transformable to Wiley ML, from Melville to Wiley ML and back again, because we still need to deliver all of those things in XML because we need to do things like deliver to NIH, which requires a specific XML format. So how do we do that? We use CSS classes, but they're not semantic. We've heard a lot about semantics at this conference. And they don't achieve any sort of data structures. We use ARIA roles to help increase accessibility and semantify elements. By the way, I don't know if you caught that in Dave's presentation. You can use attributes on HTML elements as CSS selectors. So you can use those ARIA roles as CSS selectors. Good to know. RDFA is used for data integration, and data star is an often abused HTML attribute that's perfect for internal workflows and internal workflows alone. So let's take an example. Endnotes is a popular thing in publishing, and there are tons of endnotes in scholarly publishing. So here we have something totally redundant. This is in Melville right now. We have section class equals note group, role equals doc endnotes. So I went over to my friend who is responsible for the HTML in Melville, and my other friend my colleagues and friends who are responsible for maintaining the relationship between Melville and Wiley ML, I said, why do we have this? It's completely redundant. And guess what? We're removing the redundancy in the next release. The reason this is redundant is that role equals doc notes implies that there is a group of notes that's collected underneath it, and there has to be a list of notes contained in this section. Otherwise, it's a wrong application of role equals doc endnotes, excuse me. So having class equals note group is totally redundant because you can use the your role there for the CSS selector. So in the next release of Melville, we're going to remove this. The reason we have class equals note group now was for the transformability to Wiley ML. And here is a much more layered example of author.
All right, so this is just a structural HTML presentation. There's no style, there's no data star attributes, there's no RDFA. It's just a tree, and inside that tree is names and email address of an author. But we wouldn't know that. It's just a list item. It could be anywhere. It could be on a recipe card for all we know if we're a robot. A recipe with an email address. So here we've layered in some CSS classes which give us some style layering. And if you were cheating and trying to use classes as a micro format, and there's a thing attempting to do that for eons, you can layer on, or attempt to layer on, both style and data, but that then mixes those concerns in such a way that separating them gets really tangled. So these, despite their English value names, are really just for style in our case, but adds a layer of interestingness. Then we add in RDFA, and the markup understandably gets bigger. But now we've said what we're talking about. It's no longer a recipe with an email address. It's something that can have a type of contributor role, so presumably a humanoid thing, or a very helpful robot, identified with this resource identifier, which happens to be a DOI. And this person who's contributing also has a relationship to the article of Schema author. So they're the author. So now we know lots about this person, creator. There's another identifier of their role affiliation. So now we've got like two things happening. And then we move on to a third thing. I think it's a third thing. Yeah, it's a different identifier. So now we've specified that this is not a robot, it's a person, and that person has an identifier. So we've crammed in all kinds of meaning thanks to RDFA. And that maps into all the places where we store these things in graphs or across various CMSs, because all these things have identifiers throughout the process. This is the part I really like. And that schema email now, because of its context, is associated with the author, not the recipe, which didn't exist, as it turned out. I've removed all the other stuff because the slide was unbearably crowded. And these are the data star attributes, which Svea rightly noted is focused solely on internal processing semantics. Don't publish anything that says data star whatever, use these universally, because you can't. Like, that's a localized namespace for that document. They're primarily meant for JavaScript to use. We use them also with Python and whatever else that sees this markup as it goes through and does processing actions. In the end, some of them might get stripped out based on our own pipeline process. Some of them might actually see the browser and our JavaScript will do something with them, but they're for us or whoever processes Melville. Here's a figures example, which is much more terse. But during Melville's processing, we have several images of varying sizes for varying reasons. Those can get stripped out thanks to these data parameters and things also not fully shown. But this one has an identifier from our CMS as an href to be loaded from that and then injected once it's ready. And so it has a local reference in the source of the image as well as sort of a universal inside Wiley, at least, identifier so that we can retrieve the latest copy. And this is how we solve packaging.
So we also have to package these up, sometimes just for internal purposes, but we don't sell packaged Wiley publications right now. But for internal reasons, we do need to have something EPUB-like. And we were working on this right around the time of EPUB 3.1. So you may recall that I was kind of obsessed with externalized metadata at that time, and that was a big part of EPUB 3.1. So we just talked about all of this metadata that lives outside of the content. This is why I insisted on it, because all of that externalized metadata is now in the OPF of this packaged Wiley publication, And it's just link record equals melville.jsonld. That's all it is. And now it's an EPUB. Yay. We focus a lot on layers of information. We have a picture here of a cave with strata. I've been there. It's really stunning. And we layer this content. We start with the HTML to provide a content as the foundational layer. The CSS provides style, and swapping it out, by the way, is pretty cool because we now are working on, we have the basic, beautiful HTML, which is just for display in Wiley Online Library. We're swapping out a different style sheet for EPUB, and we are working with a company called Versatype, which used to be called BiblioStyle, for print PDFs. The RDFA provides the data, Datastar provides processing information, and the ability to fully transform to Wiley ML. And voila,
questions, yeah.
we're done, and we have 17 minutes for questions.
Sweet. Or we can listen to more Gnarls Barkley. It's up to y'all.
Questions?
Can you give some recommendations for publishers that are not quite as technically savvy or as involved in standards and things like that, for how they can start this process, whether that's getting the buy-in internally, but also some of those things that they can do to kind of get the ball rolling to engage. I mean, you guys started with an XML workflow, so you've already had a step up in some ways. What can they do to start engaging that?
You want me to take that?
Sure, we can bounce it
So
back and forth.
I think the first step is assessing the types of content that you have. If you're doing straightforward text-only content, I think this is actually a lot easier than some of the other workflows. Assessing how your content comes in is a big question. If people are, if your authors are willing to write in something that outputs HTML cleanly, you're going to have a really easy time with this. I don't remember who was talking a lot about Pandoc yesterday. If your authors, it was Nick and Simon. If you're working in that kind of workflow, this is kind of a no-brainer. If your authors are working in LaTeX and you're a STEM publisher, there's a lot more work that has to go in behind the scenes. We've been working on this for, I'm trying to remember, 4 or 5 years, and we're just beginning to see the fruits of our labor now, which sounds like a lot of, it sounds, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, but start exploring what it is that you're actually delivering to your customers. I've been advocating this for 10 years now, and I only began to get corporate buy-in about 5 years ago. But again, the main reason that I see to do this is that no one can read XML, no customer. So we have to think about what it is that we're actually delivering to our customers. I think that's the starting point. What do your customers need? We have to remember that we have users, we have customers. So that is where I would start. And then from a workflow perspective, you have to look at what your input is and what you actually are outputting to your customers. And I would start with that.
Yeah, definitely focus on the shortest distance between input and output.
Yeah.
And if that makes sense from, you're primarily outputting HTML and EPUB, then if you can write as close to that and process into it thanks to Pandoc, then you've shortened your process already. And then when you get into all this stuff, you get search engine optimization and all kinds of extra toys as you hook in RDFA and things like that.
And take a look at those tools Benjamin listed in his slides.
They're all good.
What's the role of your vendors in all this? What are you handing to them? What are they expected to deliver back to you? Because assuming that they're a big part of this whole process.
They actually are not. Let me take a step back. It depends who you ask. Right now, there's a little bit of a corporate discussion about that. Should we involve the vendors or not? Because the vendors have traditionally been involved in creating Wiley ML, and that will continue to be the case. As far as where they are after that point, we created the Melville process to be vendor-free. It is an automation. The entire thing was part of a project called Wiley Publishing Automation, and everything else, it's supposed to be vendor-free. So not every book or article will necessarily be a candidate for this. So that gorgeous glossy architecture book isn't going to be involved in this. But a low-level journal article that has no images, or there aren't any with no images, but something that's a candidate for automation, it's vendor-free.
So you've controlled the whole ecosystem internally for this?
And we're also working with like the Scholarly HTML community group and others, to try and build similar looking standards that Melville's in part born out of, to encourage authors to write as close to this format as possible. And as tools like Jupyter or Apache Helium, not Helium, Zeppelin, Helium is a sub-project, get closer to researchers and they start using these things to analyze their data and code R in the browser and get all these little things connected, then they're like right there. They're already in HTML. They're already in like graphy pointed components that they've assembled into their article, and it's already webby. And so if we move that into feeding the front of our pipeline, then authors are much closer to our processing workflow, and we can get it to the web faster, we can get it to print faster, is the hope.
And so it's not dependent on any particular authoring tool. There's a number of different...
It's not meant to be, and as much as possible we push all these things into standards so that it's not even dependent on our idiosyncratic approach. Because the more of that becomes common, then the less all of us have to do, which means we can focus on what we all love, which is the actual content, and can get back to publishing that and not spending most of our money and time on like how we got that content and where it goes next and how it goes on. Like, that needs to all die, and we go from author to publisher as quickly as possible with all the value adds that we want to do.
So, knowing the challenges of implementing this within Wiley, which is a very large, resource-rich organization, let's say, I mean, you might disagree, but compared to very small publishers who would have relatively fewer resources and perhaps less knowledge about the intricacies of these things, how likely is it, do you think, that a workflow like this would be adopted widely, particularly among the non-major publishers in the industry?
I do think it depends on things like how widely acknowledged something like scholarly HTML becomes. So scholarly HTML, for those who are not familiar with it, is an effort from a community group, and the W3C community groups are free, to sort of take HTML and say, here's how we're going to use it in the scholarly community, and here's the linked data that will associate with it. It never came to full fruition, and there's a lot of interest in it right now in the scholarly community. I would love to see that come back up. I was very involved in it. Benjamin was involved in it. Some of our good friends and colleagues were involved in it as well. There's a need for leadership there now. A lot of the people who were most involved in it had to step away for various reasons. If we saw renewed involvement in that and kind of support for that in the scholarly world, I do think that you'd see organizations like NISO and STM support that. And then I think it would be inevitable that everybody would have to get involved whether they wanted to or not.
And I think from a non-scholarly perspective, there are actually people here, like Nick and Simon previously, working on getting their authors into CMSs and writing HTML books. There's also things, and Dave, yeah, there's also things like Gitbook and things that move the authoring experience closer to a web and EPUB output, and then from there to an automated PDF and things like that. And authors gravitate to that because they're also blogging and tweeting, and they're in this web browser thing all the time. They bring up another site to work on their book, or they're even using Google Docs inside of a browser anyhow. So they're in this space, and if their book editing platform and research platform all becomes one experience, then it's not a shock to them when you say, hey, go here and put your content in here. It changes habits, which is probably the hardest part. But
They don't want to change their habits, there's always Pandoc.
there's always Pandoc. Exactly.
Right.
Plays the Pandoc card.
It's also one other thing that's particular to the scholarly community. One of the reasons we looked at this at Wiley, and I should have mentioned this in my initial slide, is that one of the trends that we're seeing in research is that people don't care about the article as much as they care about the research associated with it. And so you can publish the article so that you get your hit and you can be published for tenure purposes, but no one's reading the article. They're gathering the data associated with the article. And that's not necessarily, you can't do that as easily with a PDF as you can with HTML. And so we kind of want to standardize a way to do that. Yeah. And we have to get there.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks.
Deborah.
So the whole workflow is amazing, and it's really cool to see. But I saw this one drive by in your slide, this sort of expensive but low-hanging, straightforward fruit, which you mentioned, which was
Image descriptions.
You knew I was going to, didn't you? Alt text, if there's money for it, was actually. And so the question and of course I understand why there's nothing you can do about that, because it's low-hanging and yet expensive, is generating meaningful alt text. So what can, say, people who work in university libraries, who I'm assuming have some say or some influence, say to Wiley to influence the when there's money for it aspect of these kind of things?
So I have made great strides at Wiley to influencing the image descriptions in books. The journals community has not yet gotten woke about accessibility. Maybe we need to work on that. I don't have an answer there.
Okay.
It's just as important for scholarly. I think students in colleges, which, in universities, need journal articles just as often as they need books. Maybe not as often, but that's where the action often happens in universities. Once that happens, there's going to be a revolutionary in the scholarly publishing community, and people are not going to know what hit them.
Okay.
Sounds impressive. Another thing that I would add to this, and I'm not as involved in accessibility or the inner workings of Wiley politics, is that one of my hopes with web annotation was that things like advanced image descriptions, even beyond alt text, could be pushed to an annotation layer, or rather provided by annotators, even if it didn't exist, and even if you couldn't beg the company to do it because they've got money in their mind and not your actual needs. That someone else who cared about you, or when you care about someone else, you could still provide that image description, just as a lot of presenters have willfully done in the room. When an image is on the slide, they talk through what the image is, and I was super impressed by people who did it yesterday. I don't think I did a good job today, but I did try, because I loved seeing that, and it like brought accessibility into a thing that I understood. It was like, oh, that's it. Like what I've been typing in these alt text boxes is for this, and that makes sense to me. But there are loads of cases where a publisher, because they've got money on their brain, isn't gonna process that. They're gonna look at percentages of people and just see a stat, and that's wrong. But for the people who care about them, who may not work there, if something like annotation exists, or some community-led thing, or the librarian says like, I'm waiting on people to check out books, and I'm gonna contribute these to a commons of image descriptions, and that image shows up in lots of books. If we do the annotation right, then that image has a common description. And it gets to the place where it's a community as well. And I'd also put a little bit of onus on authors. If you put an image in your book, don't expect the editorial staff at the publisher to do that for you. Like, that's part of your content. So,
in terms of scholarly publishing, I'm not even sure how to ask this, but what are the restrictions or protocols that are going to be put into place around copying content? So if you have to cite something, it's much preferable to just do a copy and paste than to have to sort of retype it and make mistakes.
So I can touch on that a little bit, maybe? So it's,
Yeah, go ahead.
So technology is easy and the people are hard. The technology for copy paste is probably the best thing the world of computers have ever given us, right? It's about the only thing that ever works consistently anyway. One of the things technologically that is possible thanks to the web annotation data model is copying it with reference, so that when you copy it, you would copy a citation and not just the text. So it becomes then almost iteratively harder to plagiarize, because if your clipboard's always full of the pointers of where you got something, perhaps even with a verifiable claim that you copied it out of this thing, then now when you move that around, it has additional meaning, and it's not just some text that you could claim was yours or whatever. And that then allays publisher fears, and author fears, which then goes a little bit farther to the people problem of putting character limits and stuff on how much you can reuse, because it then is like a data point and clarifiable. And so there's a bit of a network effect. By enabling some of these technologies, we can influence the people social problem. Until then, the people social problem might influence the technology, so there's a bit of a race condition. But in and when you can help that happen and encourage people to do citations and reuse in a way that is not catering to a publisher per se, but is helping create an ecosystem of knowledge that points all the arrows. It looks a heck of a lot like that really messy Tim Berners-Lee graph from the beginning. That's the core idea, like the title alone of information management, a proposal. When you couple that to what the web was meant to be, and then look at how we silo it and box it up, then you see that there's a mismatch with what this was meant to be and what it's become. So I think a lot of it is just pushing it back into a webbier thing. And there are technologies to do that, and then there's also need for social change as well. So great question. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you.